Welcome everyone. It's Angelo Robles. Today, a global family office structuring conversation with Marnin Zurich, Luxembourg, Dubai, Singapore, and the 50 million or $50 million question. Well, as my title states, Martin Michaels is our guest. He's a partner at Baker McKenzie in Zurich and one of the most widely recognized wealth management, tax, and family office attorneys in the world. For 25 years, he has structured the affairs of international families and financial institutions from the center of Europe. He's the author of two legal treatises on international taxation and international estate planning, and he sits on his firm's global alternative capital team, which advises family offices, founders, and even sovereign wealth. Marnin Michaels, welcome back to the show.
Good to be back. It's been about 5 years.
Well, maybe not quite that long, but it has been a long time. Your name comes up all the time in my global travels and conversations. And without further ado, I could see the audience chomping at the bit. Why don't we get right to it? So money is moving across borders right now at speed that I think I've never seen. And I'm probably a little older than you in 25, 30 years. Where is it actually going? And more importantly, where is it running from?
Well, Angela, it's an interesting question, interesting point. I will agree with you that money is moving faster and people are moving money to different locations in a different way than they've done in the last 25 years. What I would say, if you're asking me personally, I think it's not that money is moving away from somewhere. I think that families are going back to 1920s planning, and people like us who've had the benefit of living through the Cold War, which was actually a relatively stable period of time, and the last 30 years have had the benefit of a level of stability in the world that has not really been seen in the last 5,000 years, or if it had, it was 25 years here and there. What we're seeing now is a desire for people to recognize that we are in a different world than we were in the last 100 years, and that people are looking for optionality. So if you're asking, are people running away? No, but they're building optionality if things change.
For most of history, kind of leading into my question and your answer to it, a family protected wealth by choosing the right assets. I will still say they do, but there's a but. Today, the dominant variable is perhaps choosing the right jurisdiction. When did that flip? And well, I think I know the answer to this. Is it permanent? Nothing's ever permanent.
I will respectfully challenge that, because if you look at the last 300 to 500 years, at least with respect to continental Europe, people kept money in Switzerland for safety and stability because it was safe and stable, because the countries around it were not safe and stable. So they had assets at home, and then they had assets abroad. And the assets abroad were typically 10 to 15% of what they had, and the assets at home were 80 to 85 to 90% of what they had. If you're asking me now, the big change is it's more people talking about a third, a third, a third, a third, a third, a third, because they view the world as transforming, and it's not only transforming in relation to other items, but I would call it a regulatory arbitrage. They see rules being applied in different ways. I mean, let me give you the simplest example. If you happen to have been born in 1991 in what was Moscow at the time, in the former Soviet Union, right before it fell, and your family immigrated to the US, under Russian law, you're still a Russian national. If you have a bank account in Switzerland under the EU and Swiss interpretation of sanctions rules, you are an in-scope Russian for the purposes of sanctions. And people didn't necessarily appreciate that. And so they have a concern about when's the next time something like that happens, and then my assets are sort of in a bit of a limbo situation, or the same with the trusteeship. And that just happens to be where they see. So they see different regulatory arbitrages in a different way. They also see different countries applying different types of regulatory regimes to specific assets, and they just want to make sure that should the wrong set of facts happen, they have some safety and security.
All good points for sure. And everyone really excited about today's conversation. Certainly a very special guest. Normally, I would have an hour and a half to 2 hours, but mainly me, not Marnin. My schedule doing this live, which is always a little more challenging, is a little bit tighter. So,
But much more fun and makes it much more challenging for both of us.
well, my audience will appreciate. Oh my God, that means Angelo has to be more concise. I'm going to try.
Let's do it.
So I believe you wrote recently, and this is all building up into or building upon my first two questions. You wrote recently about planning for wars and unplanned exits. What was happening in your practice that kind of made you want to put that on paper, so to speak?
Well, Angelo, this is one of those times where I'm going to talk very deeply and very personal. We have not spoken since 2022. You may not be aware that my wife is Ukrainian. You may not be aware that her family lives in Ukraine. You may not be aware of the fact that another chunk of my family lives in Israel. And the events of the last 4 years, and having to deal with, even as those things affect, my simple family, affected my life, has been evolving my thinking on this topic over the last 4 or 5 years in general. Now, let's go to the events of this year. I have a little tradition that I do on Friday mornings. On Friday mornings, if I have a friend or a relative that lives in a war zone, I always send a check-in email. Hey, how's it going? Now, it used to take me 10 or 15 minutes to do so. When we got to April of this year, and I started adding in all the various countries of countries and country codes where I had to call, there was one day in the middle of April this year where I spent 3 hours just touching base with friends and family who were in a war zone, or were literally, in an area where there was a drone or a missile hit. And I must say, what's driving this for me is the daily conversations I'm having with people who've never experienced a missile hit. I experienced my first missile hit in 1991, but most have not. Most have never gone through this before, and that's resulting in people thinking about things in ways they'd never thought about before. Plus, I'm watching this television show now. I think it's called Linus. There was a quote about what the Ukraine war is these days, and also it doesn't hold only true for the Ukraine war, but it's all the wars now. We're going back to World War I fighting, meeting Star Wars. And what's scaring people now into what is making them think about things is anyone with $80 can attach a grenade, and the next thing you know, you have a grenade dropping into your town. And so that's what's driving this for me.
Well, that's very personal for you to share. Do appreciate to my audience, and gives context a little bit from your perspective, and certainly wish your loved ones, friends, and acquaintances the best. Always a difficult question for someone to answer, because it puts you in a little bit of a spot. You being a sharp attorney are going to probably figure out a way around it, Marnin, but we shall give this a try. Which country is the most overrated destination for private wealth, and maybe what's the most underrated?
Oh, so my response to that is everything is at the same time overrated and at the same time underrated. And that's a lawyer, and it's not a lawyer answer. I still would tell someone the UAE is a valid option if you're coming from Yemen. I still think UAE is a great place to be. I also think, quite frankly, in the scheme of things, I trust the Emiratis to take down a missile or a drone far better than I trust, say, the Swiss to take down a missile or a drone. So if you're asking me, um, I don't feel there's anywhere safe anymore, or there is no place that is, unless you're willing to live in Paraguay, I'm not sure there's any place that's better safe or not. I think it's a question of the optionality of what you can do and when you're going to do it.
I wanted to leave the question a little more open ended. You answered it from more of a structural perspective. Audience, I promise, even in our limited hour and 4 minutes left, I will get to some specific countries, some of them pretty obvious that I would note. And why don't we start maybe indirectly with one right now? Happens to be the country that I'm a citizen of and where I'm in right now. So let's just make the assumption a wealthy non-American does real business in the US. Where is the line between doing business in America and becoming, here's the key part, an American for tax purposes? How thin is that line?
Well, interesting, Angelo, because I actually don't think necessarily becoming an American for tax purposes is per se a problem. Because in the end of the day, when you compare the US tax rates to most of the other world, they're still pretty effective tax rates. I think with a little bit of planning, it can be managed quite effectively. I think the challenge with spending time in the US and doing business in the US is if you have the wrong visa, if you hold it for too long a period, this being particularly green cards, if you hold a green card in 8 out of 15 years and then you want to exit, there can be a very nasty exit tax. And if you happen to have a kid who's an American, very nasty inheritance tax that can be applied. So I think doing business in the US, I mean, for what it's worth, the US is still the greatest place in the world to have the least business interference in running a good business. Whether, that was true under the last administration and it's true under this administration. I would argue slightly better under this administration, but also more risky under this administration and slightly more challenging from a regulatory perspective in the past, but also more stable in the past. So I think it's always been that case, and you still have a market of 350 plus million people in a relatively economically friendly way where you can do business and you can get off the ground. There's a reason why everyone wants to do business in the US. The question is, if you want to do business in the US and you need to be in the US and you need to be a US tax resident, on what visa do you stay in the US to mitigate the tax effect?
That is the question.
The long-term tax effect.
You brought up an area that maybe people stumble on, the green card. So why should a global family think very hard before taking in that green card, knowing that, yes, you're correct about US tax rates compared to others around the world, but there's a but coming up that you didn't quite get to. You hinted at it. And that once you got that green card, or once you're a US citizen, or like you said, a child born here, you may be tied into our tax system, which to me onerously follows you all over the world.
Correct. If you're asking me in an ideal world, I would rather people be spending time in the US on a visa other than a green card. And if you are a global family, there are typically other options available to you. Not everyone, but to many, that will give you the ability to spend time in the US and have your family spend time in the US.
If the family already made the mistake, let's assume it's the green card, is that something, I guess everything could, but could be unwound? And what kind of time and cost or tax hit might come with that?
Well, as a general rule, if you hold a green card in 8 out of 15 years, which is effectively 6 years and 2 days, then you are in it for the purposes of exit taxes and the deemed inheritance tax. If you're before that, and it happens quite regularly, I see that. I have people consider giving up the green card and taking another visa. I will actually advocate the following. If you are a 15-year green card holder, I actually think you should be a citizen.
Interesting. Setting politics aside, has the temperature the last 3 years changed for non-Americans? And this is a slight twist on the other questions, thinking about holding US assets and what specifically would worry them. So not a green card, not citizenship. Maybe they set up an LLC in Delaware, New Hampshire, South Dakota, maybe whatever, any sort of trust structure, and they're holding US assets. Where does that get a little gray intertwined and get complex?
So I'm going to answer this question from a number of perspectives. If I were a person with PRC connections, I would never be setting up a trust in the US today. And the reason being, if the Russia playbook were to be applied to the PRC and the forced exit of those trusts, I cannot in good consciousness tell someone with a PRC connection, even if the kids are in the States, to set up a US trust today under US law. That's first and foremost. That's part one. I think what does affect what people do is, if you believe you're from a jurisdiction that you believe the politics of the US and that country could be more difficult in the future, I think from a structural perspective, I think you might consider what you're doing. The US estate tax on US shares is not a new thing. I think people are becoming more sensitive to it, and the costs of it are more complex. I think probate issues with US assets are becoming more well known as a complex issue. Having said that, I would actually think, tell you, based upon what I'm seeing today, making an investment in the US for business purposes is actually probably happening more than it was in the past, because as unstable as one might perceive the US to be, the rest of the world is more.
100%. All things that we will get into, and maybe controversial takes from what you're describing. Building upon that a little bit, and you kind of answer this, but let's maybe do that little more granular answer. Question: is the US still the best place to deploy capital, even if it may debatably be not such the greatest of places to become, my words, a resident?
I would say it this way: the US is one of 2 or 3 places where deploying capital is relatively easy to do, and that's why people do it. But what people are thinking twice with is when they say things like potential currency controls being put in place, and there won't be a currency control in the old ways where you can't move money freely in and out. There'll be things like a proposal of a 1.5% tax on transfers in and out. And this is a proposal that was made already. It creates enough friction to make people think twice. I think people are still making investments. I think it's still an amazing stock market. I think US tech companies are doing a great job. I think it's not the only country in the world where US tech companies are doing a great job, but they are. And I think people will continue to make investments in the US, and that's not going to stop. But I do think people are sometimes saying, well, I will not have 80% in the US anymore, or 50% in the US. They might have 40% in the US and 60% abroad.
You did mention you do agree that the US is one of the best markets. Let's broadly go to invest in. Really hard to argue that from an overall perspective of contract law, military protection of your assets and resources. I could go on, but that does imply that there may be 1, 2, or 3 others that are at least within consideration. If you don't mind, which hints at my earlier question, what might 1, 2, or 3 of those other countries be?
I would say it this way. I would say it this way. I think the US is a great place. I think people want to be in the US for the investment opportunity. I think what's slowing people down is perceived regulatory risk, perceived freezing of assets, perceived risk that it'll be harder to transfer money in and out. The market may be up 40%, but if your currency is down 30%, you're only up 10%. So the result is you see people saying, well, maybe an account based in Switzerland focused on European investments is not such a bad return, because you may have only had a 12 or 13% return in the market, but you've had a 30% currency upside. And so
100%. And I totally agree.
you see people saying that. You're also seeing also effectively the world can be divided now into 4 regulatory worlds. You're in the US camp, you're in the European camp, you're in the Chinese camp, and the 4th would be you're in the non-aligned camp. And I think people are consciously choosing, and by the way, people who fall into the European regulatory regime, there are countries that follow the European regulatory regime not because they have to, but because they realize economically they must. Switzerland being one of them, that follows the EU regime. You have people who follow the North American, the US regime, primarily because they realize that most of their businesses in the US, so they have to follow that regime. You have people following the Chinese regime because they're so connected to the Chinese market they have to. And then you have people that have made a conscious choice to non-align. And I see people choosing investments based on those regulatory breakouts.
I do agree. And I do agree that most wealthy American US families, perhaps if 98 to 99%, including currency, of their assets are tied only to US assets, that might be a little too much. You mentioned Switzerland with the franc, the Norwegian krona, the Singapore dollar, diversity, a little more complexity for a US citizen in terms of getting that diversity, including of currency, but being more diversified. I wouldn't maybe be as much as you, only 40% in the US, but you're also implying a non-US family. So there are nuances there. If I could,
I didn't say an American in the States. Quite frankly,
correct.
American in the US should be 70-30 in the US.
I'm broadly in the same camp, maybe 80-20, but we're relatively on a similar alignment there. I'm going to push back a little bit on something. And you know, or at least right before we started the interview, that I did interview an iconic attorney, a friend of yours and mentor, back in January. People could go look it up, Philip Markovici, who was a wonderful guest, a wonderful gentleman. I would love to have him on. The parts of our discussion were different than the one I'm having with you.
By the way, it'd be interesting to have us both on and to see us debate each other. That would be, and you moderate that. That would be even more fun.
Oh my God, that would be great, because I didn't know that you guys would actually even disagree that much. And I don't want to put words in Philip's mouth, but I would say broadly, he's a little bit more pro EU. I called him effectively, like, are you a WEF advocate? And he had an interesting response. He basically said yes. That kind of defused me a little bit, because he knew I would be a little bit very different, and thought that he would try to hide around that question. He didn't. He went right up front with it. But my question for you, it's not about him, it's about you. I have, maybe I'm wrong, you could convince me otherwise. I love going to Europe, and I know I'm lumping in a whole bunch of countries into one, and that's very unfair. Who doesn't love the history, the architecture, the wonderful people, the little bit more, the relaxed, especially during the summer? And I don't know, like, everyone's in good shape, no one gets obese, the food appears to be healthier, pharmaceuticals are not as entrenched. I get it. There are lots of advantages. But when I also look at onerous taxes, a little bit of a let's relax the whole summer and not get anything done, no version of VC, not one company, I think, since 1972 that has cracked the Fortune 500 as a new company from Europe. That may change shortly, but it hasn't happened yet. I have concerns. I won't get into the political and immigration aspect. We'll save that for me, you, and Philip at a point in the future. Just simply from a regulatory, how they're falling behind in AI. And maybe I'll end with this final comment, and you could correct me and put me in my place. I feel like I'm in a museum. I don't feel like it's the future of how the world is changing and adapting now, next year, and within 20 years. I might be wrong, and maybe I'm the one who's not having enough fun and relaxing. Tell me where I'm right and where I might be wrong.
So let me start here. Where the EU and the Europe gets it right is there one in creating the appropriate quality of life. Okay? They create a real quality of life. And where I think they also got it right, is they're addressing the issues that are going to be created by AI for their people quicker and more fast than other places are. And I think that there's a recognition of. On the other hand, if you're going to ask me my challenge with Europe is, for the most part, there isn't the ambition. There isn't the ambition to do great things. Let me give you the simplest example. One of the greatest science schools in the world is here where I live in Zurich, and it's not so far from where I am right now in Zurich. ETH. Okay, if you look at all the top scores of all the schools, it's top 2 or 3 in the world. It's always right after MIT or Caltech, and one of the great science schools in the world. Where are the great startups coming out of Switzerland in the tech sector? You ask someone coming out of ETH now, they want to work for Google, and it's 2,000 employees in Zurich. They want to work for all the big tech companies are here. The ambition to be creative, to be ambitious. Are there great tech companies coming out of Switzerland? Yes, but they are few and far between. The ambition to fail and try and be bold and creative is not here.
I agreed with your 2 or 3 premises in terms of a wonderful lifestyle and place to live. Maybe if I already have money, I would argue. I definitely agree with your latter comment. The one where, and I don't want to make this an AI conversation too much, but Martin, my audience knows Angelo's the guy that only talks about AI, or that's what some people say over the last 2 years. I'm extremely active in AI. What do you mean? And I'm putting words in your mouth just to make it a little more bombastic, that the EU has gotten it right. They got everything wrong. They're going to fall behind to become more of a museum. Where am I wrong in my premise and you're right to how Europe is getting it in AI? I think they're absolutely not getting it.
I think you're talking about the AI strategy for how to build an AI universe. I'm talking about what you do with the people when they're not needed for work.
Do you agree that day may come, and sooner than later?
Well, let's talk about why AI is picking up the way it's picking up. And this I know is going to be controversial. Everyone's investing in AI because the millennials as a workforce are tough to work with, and that everyone is investing in AI because everyone is tired of dealing with labor law issues and complaints and people taking sick days my favorite is in Switzerland, everyone has burnout. And everyone views AI as the solution to the HR administrative issues that they're dealing with today. And don't underestimate the direct link between the approach of work over the last 20 years by many people and the desire for people to invest in AI. There's a direct link there. But ultimately, where we are going is, what are you going to do when 50% of the current people who are employed don't need to be working because you don't need them? And I think the Europeans are addressing that. I think the Emiratis have gotten it best so far, and they're really thinking about that. Well, but they have a tool that we don't necessarily have. But they're looking at the issue of, what do you do when you don't need these people? And how are we going to deal with it? And they have that experience because in Southern Europe, 50% of the people under the age of 30 have been unemployed now for 20 years.
Well, I mean, those are grave concerns. And my statement was a little bombastic. The reality is, we don't know if new jobs are going to be created. And maybe I'm talking more Americana now, but that American spirit, like I did, starting multiple companies from nothing, and two out of the 3 of them having a pretty significant exit, coming from a non-college and not really an overly educated background. Don't be fooled by my fancy suits and tie. That being said, let me push back on you a little bit. So, yeah, Norway, if that's what you're hinting at, is a tiny country, very homogenous, has a massive amount of oil, what a well over $1 trillion quote unquote sovereign wealth fund because of the oil, mainly invested in US companies, by the way. And if you go by the number of citizens, technically, probably everyone's theoretically a millionaire if you factor in their oil and the fact of they're dedicated and disciplined to have a sovereign wealth fund. Where are these countries if there's not revenue coming in? And I'm not saying tax revenue is necessarily what I only want to see as well. And this goes to the whole socialist issue rising in the US and in New York City. Where is this money magically going to come from? Taxing the rich has not proven to be a successful strategy. It is not. It stops innovation. It scares people away that are smart and successful, that employ people, that give to philanthropy, and they go elsewhere. Now, I don't want to get too bogged down in this issue. This will probably be the last comment question I have. So let me give you the final word on that, on Norway, Europe, AI, and the attitude of Europeans to the future of work and the impact of AI. It's yours.
I'm not referring to Norway because, in fact, you have $1 trillion or more than $1 trillion sovereign fund, and you have 4 million people. So, by definition, everyone is a multimillionaire who lives there. That's not the point I'm talking about. I'm talking about the reality that you have a choice. You either don't hire people, or you reduce the workday. And I actually think, if you look at what the UAE did, they ended their workday at 2 o'clock on Friday. I think, but by the end of this decade, we're going to see a 4-hour work week. I'm sorry, it's not 4-day work week, because it's the only way you deal with the fact that you don't need the people as much. And I also think, well, if you look at what the UAE has done and what you're seeing Europe doing now, is they're modulating immigration. You don't need as many people, so you turn off the spigot on immigration. Excuse what happened in Spain the last few months, but that's not an exception. But if you actually look at it, these restrictions on immigration that you're seeing are a direct result of the fact there's an understanding that we're going to a world where you don't need as many people. Now, there are exceptions to that, which is the one area where work will continue to be needed is you're going to need people who help people, and you're going to need people who want entertainment and want hospitality. And, I think that's where you're going to see things developing. And I think the Europeans are at least having a better handle on that than you see other places having a handle on it. I mean, I think the dirty little secret was Obama was tougher on immigration than anyone else has been since.
Very true. Very true.
And the fact of the matter is what we're seeing now. I don't necessarily agree with the methods, but the real issue is, why do you have all these people coming to America? They're coming to America because they're opportunities. The question that no one is asking is, what do you do in a world when you don't need as many people to operate the economy? And I do agree with you, Angela, there'll be some jobs created, but I'm not sure there will be replacements for everyone who's exited.
A deeper discussion that we could have for hours. It sounds like we're both pretty fluid on it, and maybe worthy of a discussion sometime in the winter. Let's continue with the core focus. I promised I would give you the last word on that part. So, another European country, the UK, ended the non-dom era. Where did that money actually go? And like the real winners, not just in the brochures.
I actually think the real winner was the UK.
Huh.
Because I think for the most part, first of all, if you look at the regime, two ways. First, the UK replaced its regime with something that is not really a 4-year regime, it's a 10-year regime. And effectively, if you had structures in place that were done long before you moved to the UK, you effectively have 10 years. So if you look at the old system versus the new system, it isn't that much different. And ultimately, you hear a lot of noise about people having left the UK, but most didn't. Most absorbed the situation. So ultimately, I would argue to you the UK was the big winner.
Interesting. That's a different perspective than perhaps I expected you to
The
take.
the news tells to you about the percentage that left.
Right?
The news doesn't tell you about the 70% that stayed.
Well, that's still a pretty lot of people that left. It's not 2%.
I didn't say it's 2%, but I also think in the end of the day, if you had a million people who were res non-dom in their 15 years and 700,000 stayed, who's the big winner? The big winner is the UK.
I don't know about that. I may have a little different perspective, and that relates a little bit to my hint at our prior conversation about socialism and a variety of other factors. But again, in about 30 minutes remaining, I'm going to ask a related question, but we will continue.
And by the
Britain,
way, can I go a step further?
please,
The
please.
number one thing that caused the UK to win were the missiles hitting in the Gulf.
Those questions are coming, I promise.
Yeah.
But since you brought it up, and you did mention effectively Dubai, United Arab Emirates before, I've interviewed Jimmy Sexton and David L'Esperance and other prominent jurisdictional attorneys and tax strategists. The war in Iran, what we're seeing with missiles flying into Dubai and other quote unquote Middle Eastern countries, certain things I don't believe we've ever seen before. Explain the context, how I'm building it up, and your response relative to both the UK, and you could segue into effectively UAE if you want.
Okay, so let's start with this. There was a percentage of people who were pretty flamboyant about leaving the UK and moving to the Gulf.
Yes.
As soon as those missiles flew, they were back in the UK. That did more damage to the wealthy in the UK than anything else. That as soon as it was a little unstable, they flew home. So I think that's a big point that people miss. Now I have to say I've lived in places which have missile hits are not new to me. I've lived in the Middle East for long enough to be aware of that. If you're asking me, my personal view on these things is I think the UAE handled this very well. I think it was not fun, but in the end of the day, we now live in a world where anyone with $80 and a grenade can create a drone. And I think in this particular case, it was Iran. But what's to stop? This is the future of military warfare. This is not an Iran issue. This is the future. And I think what the UAE did show is they could handle it. And in fact, given, I was there in April, and I would say people were a bit more depressed then, but I spoke to a friend of mine who was there last week. Everything's back to normal for the most part. Everything's back to normal. And I think what they showed is they could handle it. And I think the short answer is, a couple years ago, there was a big hullabaloo about some Chinese balloon over the US, which really caused no real damage. We see more airports closed because of unintended drones now, even in the US, than was in the history in the past. I think the real challenge we have is how are we going to deal with a world where anyone can create a military. And how you handle that is the really interesting question.
I would certainly love to do a deeper dive into that. It'll indirectly come up in some other questions upcoming, but given our limited time, I'm going to move a little bit to the country that you happen to be in now and is renowned as a center of great wealth. People have been writing, however, about Switzerland's obituary since so-called banking secrecy ended. It keeps not dying. If anything, it's even growing. Why?
So I'd like to distinguish between two independent topics, okay? And that is Switzerland is a place to live, and Switzerland is a place to keep money.
Good point.
Okay, and we have to distinguish, and actually I even go a step further, a place to do business. And I would actually argue to you, Switzerland's still a great place to live. It's still got a very high quality of life. Compared to the way the rest of the world is, it's still relatively safe and relatively secure. So I think that hasn't changed. And as long as that doesn't change, there'll be a large percentage of the wealth that's kept in Switzerland because of that. Okay. Vis-a-vis a place to keep your money, I'm not arguing that a portion of everyone's money must be kept in the US. I am fully a believer in that percentage of the money must be in the US. That I'm fully a believer in, first and foremost. The question is, what do you do with the rest? And when you're dealing with the rest, you have to ask yourself the question of, where do you want to be investing if you don't want to be investing in North America? And if you don't want to be investing in North America, then there are not many places that you can get global diversification on your portfolio with the level of sophistication that you can get out of the Swiss banks. The Singaporean banks can do it for the most part as well, but ultimately, at the end of the day, for the most part, you're back to a Swiss bank.
Agreed. A related question, which may relate a little bit to, like you said, residency. I would now bring in family office structuring and trust structuring, coupled with where assets are. So those are three different things. That is very, very true. The question, Switzerland kind of has no bespoke family office regime. You could correct me. The way that I could argue Singapore, Luxembourg, and I think even UAE have. Correct. I could say that's a weakness, or is the absence of a regime actually an advantage and a product in its own way?
Interesting. I view it differently. I view it differently. I view Switzerland didn't need a family office regime because the default law made it interesting enough that you didn't need a special regime. I think the other places needed to create a regime to make it interesting to attract it.
That is a bit of a different perspective than the question that I asked.
You're asking me why did the UAE create a regime, or why did Singapore create a regime? I think that's more about attracting high quality individuals to work in those family offices than it is
for the family compared to the family itself.
Yeah, the family itself.
Okay, I mean, I promised I would come back to the question, and you could take it from a residency, family office, and tax structuring, or where assets are. Most people would deem the players in that space to be the US, to be Switzerland, to be United Arab Emirates, to be Singapore. We could debate structuring in Luxembourg. We'll get to that shortly. But countries like them in Monaco, they're very unique. They're very small. They may not be a great residency for everyone, and there's nuances to it. Maybe for those that want a higher tax rate but don't mind, may like a little bit of the lifestyle of a New Zealand or a Norway. It's not for me to decide, but maybe sticking strictly from a safety of money, structuring, and assets perspective, those appear to be the big players. We kind of discussed all of them, except for maybe Luxembourg to a degree. I'm not going to, okay, maybe I will tell you to rank them depending on family office structuring, taxes, and that will vary if you're a US citizen, green card holder or not. Why don't I shut up and allow you to go a little bit around the world of advantages and disadvantages of what I noted or others that I didn't yet bring up?
Okay, so let's talk about something which I don't think you talked about, which is ultimately where the fund's custodied.
Of course.
And ultimately, in the end of the day, 80% of the world's wealth is with 7 global custodians. And so one of the questions you have to start asking yourself is, are you going around the world only to end up with the same global custodian? I would argue to you, it doesn't really matter what bank you're with in Switzerland, you end up at UBS. Because UBS ends up custodying almost everyone's assets on some level. So in the end of the day, you're choosing, Do you want a US global custodian? Do you want a European global custodian? Or do you want an Asian global custodian?
In
And that's how
theory, why not all three?
well, you want all three provided that you are actually investing in that part of the world. I see
True.
no, okay, so meaning if you go to a Singaporean bank to invest in the United States, I don't think you've accomplished anything.
Right. Agreed.
Okay. Okay. But but if you talk to the registered investment advisors in Switzerland servicing Americans who want diversification, they will tell you 80% of the assets are American assets they're holding. Okay. So that's the first. I want to distinguish between that and structuring jurisdictions. Okay, it is true Luxembourg has some excellent banks. It is true that Monaco has some good banks. But in the end of the day, these are structuring jurisdictions. They are providing appropriate vehicles. Liechtenstein has some good banks, but these are structuring jurisdictions, not financial services jurisdictions.
Completely agreed. And I know it's more complex for a US citizen because we're not going to get the tax arbitrage or again a green card holder. But if I'm looking at structures, Luxembourg appears very well organized from a family office structuring, a trust structuring, a foundation. We don't want to make this a 3-hour tax discussion.
Mhm.
Sadly, Martin, you and I may like it, but people may get bored.
They'll get bored. They'll get bored.
But in terms of the highlights of it, let's assume non-US citizen Luxembourg with a combination of assets in Switzerland, the US appears to be a little bit of a tough combination to beat. Where am I maybe right directionally and where you would maybe take a different
I
perspective?
think for fund structuring, you're 100% correct. For fiduciary structuring, I don't agree with you.
Then who would you choose from the fiduciary side?
Fiduciary side, you're either looking at a place like Liechtenstein for civil law vehicles, or you're looking at Caribbean jurisdictions for trust structures.
Would you prefer to Cayman or others? Bahamas,
Cayman, Bahamas,
St. Kitts,
Saint,
etc.
I tend to prefer the jurisdictions that are have a more sophisticated jurisdiction. I tend to take the Cayman, Bahamas, Bermuda type level jurisdictions. I tend not to go to the jurisdictions that have very limited case law, very limited court systems to handle that. And
Good points. Please continue.
I'll tell you my view. My view is you don't want to be in a jurisdiction where the judge is related to your lawyer, or the trustee is related to your lawyer, or you can't get someone to take your case because conflicts. I want to be in a jurisdiction which is large enough where you have enough options to deal with those issues.
Should my family office structuring an actual domicile of a non-US, either satellite to US or non-US family period, the actual entity be in Switzerland?
The likelihood that I would use a Swiss vehicle for a non-Swiss family is quite low.
So Liechtenstein and some of the Caribbean locations.
Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Caribbean jurisdictions are probably places I would likely go.
Now, if I'm going to have the actual structure, now today's world is getting more diverse, remote, and AI is changing everything, but I'm going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever number of employees. Does that become a little more difficult in a very tiny community like a Liechtenstein or even some of the Caribbean islands that you're noted? Do I have talent that is going to want to work and live there?
I want to distinguish between the structure and
Yes.
where you're operating the structure. A Liechtenstein a BVI trust or a Cayman trust with a subsidiary operating in the UAE can make a lot of sense, or Singapore can make a lot of sense, or having a specific vehicle used to house those people, and that's where those family office regimes becomes very interesting. So if you're looking for people to work, you might have a family office regime entity under a trust, as an example. But ultimately, here's the dirty little secret. Once you get out of Switzerland, New York, or New York/Miami/LA, the Gulf and certain Gulf states, Singapore, and to a lesser extent Hong Kong, you can't find the people you need to do this type of holding of assets in a meaningful way.
Yes, and now you're getting a little bit into my world of the single family office. But again, AI and remote is changing some level of dynamics to that. I did want to keep it more of a non-US discussion. And I do feel to be somewhat of a global citizen and traveled, and I have members and relationships all over the world. But the one related question, bringing it into the US, if I'm a US citizen, let's forget about a satellite family office. Would I likely want to set up my structures in South Dakota, partially due to privacy? Wyoming could be good there as well. LLC structures could be good. I would have mentioned Delaware, and I don't want to wear too much politics on my sleeve, but I think Elon is correct. They do have some activist judges there, and it's starting to concern me. Now, I could have my structures in South Dakota. I could have my LLCs in New Hampshire, but I may want to live in a state that gives a lot of personal protections, and maybe my family office is in Florida. What is wrong with my trifecta, my assumptions, or is it do you think effectively 100%?
I'm an advocate of using Nevada and Florida.
Okay. You and I both mentioned Florida. Not many people do. Why do you mention it?
Well, with the exception of one challenge in the Florida law with respect to it doesn't have a credit protection law, trust law. You find high quality people to work in your family office there.
Agreed.
And you have a regulatory regime that's friendly, and a fiduciary law that's relatively friendly.
And you mentioned Nevada, where, yes, I agree, it's a force, including for private trust companies, but almost everyone first leads with South Dakota and maybe Wyoming. Why Nevada for you?
Because it's not the one everyone talks about first.
Is there something specific about Nevada that is not proprietary to your intellect going through thousands
the bottom line is whether it's Nevada, Wyoming, New Hampshire, Delaware, the law is or Alaska, the law is pretty much the same. If one comes up with something innovative, the other copy within 2 years. So the law is identical. To me, the questions become, and by the way, I do set up structures in South Dakota on some level of frequency as well. But if you're asking me, I want to be in a place where you have a large enough set of lawyers to handle the matters, a large enough economy that's not dependent on this business to function, and a place where people are going to want to live. I personally wouldn't mind living in Alaska, but I think I might be an exception.
Yes, you may be, well, to some people, a bit of an exception. I do have some relationships in Canada. What global advice, tax arbitrage structuring, their affiliation with Bahamas, Caymans, whatever it may be, what international recommendations may you give to the Canadian billionaire?
I will just say I'm not doing enough in Canada for Canadian families who are in Canada to be able to talk competently on that.
And given that you're based in Europe, and we discussed Switzerland, Luxembourg, you a little bit of Liechtenstein. When we were in a different conversation, I brought up one of the Scandinavian countries, Norway. We didn't talk about Italy, some of their unique tax holiday. Again, American citizens are going to be a little hand-tied. Also, its proximity, especially northern Italy to Switzerland. What do you think about an Italy and maybe one other country where we're not bringing up, we don't talk about enough, maybe Portugal or Malta?
So I want to distinguish between two topics there. Those are countries where people have to live. And those are very effective places if someone wants to find a place to live and enjoy life. I would say equally Greece and Poland are equally good opportunities for that. When I give advice to someone about where they want to live, it's not only about the taxes, it's about quality of life and also water security and food security. And some of the questions that influence where I put people is, do I have food security where that place is? And that typically keeps me away from islands, and water security keeps me away from islands.
Very good points. And I do agree with you in a massive advantage to the US. And there are multiple. We mentioned some of them. Oceans on both sides. Let's go with the word friendly neighbors. We could debate that. Our military, contract law, VC, commerce, the world kind of settles in dollars, although that does appear to be weakening. Natural resources, oil, AKA energy. But there's two big ones that we probably don't talk about enough. And again, I don't want to make this a billionaire preppers discussion, but probably the greatest overall farmland on earth. And broadly, maybe not great, but good freshwater supply.
Excellent freshwater supplies, with the possible exception of Canada.
Yes, that is correct. And some of the challenges of Europe from an energy perspective, from natural resources, and again, these are deeper discussions if we had a little more time. I did promise my audience in my titling and my subtitle, and we covered this a lot in our last interview, but let's bring it up here at least for one question. And that is for a newbie of wealth that wants to consider a family office, a formal single family office. In the US, we have the framework of Lender versus IRS from 2017 that broadly we could debate. There's other models, probably works somewhat globally. I have a formal structure. That's my single family office, AKA management company. And I have other structures, including LLCs and or holding company for my assets and resources. We don't have time to get into the art of nuances of who owns what, but how do they work together, intertwined? And could I even make it more complicated and say the holding company and a philanthropic initiative, how they could coordinate better together?
So ultimately, a family office or family offices do three things: concierge services, consolidation of reporting, legal and tax is the second one, and investment services. The question is what you want to be doing with a family office. I'm not a big fan of setting up a family office unless you have very significant wealth. I think you can buy many of the services for various options that are there, particularly on the concierge side. But in the end of the day, the reporting and the like, some of the new software is coming online. I mean, that was someone's offering a consolidation services now, including linking to taxes, for $50,000 a year. Now I forget the name of the company, but off the top of my head, but it's up there, charging $50,000 a year as a service to do the consolidated reporting and linking into your bank accounts and pulling it together. That would make me think twice about dealing with that. And the area where I think people need a family office for, and I think it's not worth doing it unless you have very substantial wealth, is the investment side. Because in the end of the day, the investments, if you just want publicly traded assets, there are lots of options how to get the investment approach. Where it becomes interesting is when you want access to options that you can't get access to easily, where the fund is oversubscribed by 2 billion and you want in. And that requires, or you want access to the private markets that aren't there, or private investments. That, I must say, is what everyone wants, and everyone wants, quote unquote, a guy to get them that. But in the end of the day, I'm not sure you're really getting that. And I do think, for the most part, what you pay for the guy, unless you can afford to buy them full time, is such an expensive cost. I'll give you an example. I have a client who has a VC fund. They're doing like Fund 8 or Fund 9 right now. It's oversubscribed by 2 billion. Even I, who represent the fund, asked if I could get in for a small investment. Sorry, we're oversubscribed. But okay. But someone was out there selling, I can get you access to this fund. So I said, okay, let's have a call. Yeah, they got 100 million ticket. where they put it in a Singapore, a Luxembourg fund, and instead of costing you 2 and 10, they're charging 3 and 30 to get access. So the question is, what does that access cost, and can you actually make a decent return at 3 and 30? And all that fund is doing is taking their 150 million tranche and going to give it to smaller tickets.
Very interesting, Martin. Oh boy, I would love to have a friendly debate on this subject. We could debate that I'm conflicted. I'm a single family office person. Therefore, you would think I'm going to think of reasons why there should be more of them. So you might be right about that assumption. I just wrote a book. No, I'm not making this up. It's up on my website called Should I Have a Family Office? Really, should I have a single family office? I was that person when I last spoke to Marnin, let's say 4 or 5 years ago, that said probably $500 million to 750 million. But I don't think I thought it through enough. So I did change my mind. And also, intelligence went up, yet the cost went down. Marnin, give me 45 seconds, then I'll allow you to comment.
So let me make the following point to you, and that is, I believe AI and many of the family office services will be available on a quasi-commoditized basis in the next 5 years.
Okay, then you're basically, I mean, that's along the thesis that I'm thinking about. First of all, in the US, lender versus the IRS may allow tax advantages depending on if it fits certain criteria. What apply to lender may not apply to you. I understand all those things. But then I also get privacy control and customization. And then if I bring in AI, sovereign AI, where I own the hardware, I use open weight models, I build agents. By the way, I build my own software and software for other families that we work on collectively in what I call my AI masterclass. Technically, one of them produced last week about 27 different artifacts, markdowns, and structures that my members could take away with them and build upon that. I am an advocate. I know most of the industry would disagree. I am open for debate. You could have a single family office, depending on your complexity, even as low as $50 million. I'll debate anyone on that. I know you disagree, Marnin.
I'm not disagreeing. I'm saying to you, for that, pay the $50,000 and get the software that'll do it for you.
Well, yes, and I'm going to maybe.
And that's not a single family office. That's just buying software.
And I could debate that I might be able, if not now, within a year, by prompting to effectively create my own software that is more private. I'm not renting it, I'm owning it. But theoretically, from what you're describing, yes, you're accurate. And AI and the intelligence of AI allows me to have intelligence that I'm buying, that I'm owning at a lesser cost than me not needing 9. And I know this is going to sound terrible and you're all going to give me hate for this, but a 50 to 100 to $150 million family office could get by with 1 or 2 people. It does not need 4 or 5 or 10. You don't necessarily need to be investing in a million private deals. If you look at the math of public versus private markets and you're patient and tax efficient, most of you are probably better off in the public markets anyway, while being liquid. But there are some wonderful investors and investments out there that maybe, if you're very tactical, have certain access, that sure, investing in the private markets could do you good. Marnin, in the essence of time, I have 2 final questions. Audience, I'm very sorry. I failed you. You had about 7 or 8 questions. I never got to any of them, and I'm going to have to run in about 3 or 4 minutes. So sadly, that's on me. Marnin, the final 2 questions. How about we'll play a little game. Forget every client, your own family, your own money. Maybe I'm going to just snap my fingers and make you a billionaire. A passport, a country of residence, and a structure. What would you do?
If I could pick any passport, I would love to have an Emirati passport because they think they're probably the best out there. I would like to have a residency. I'd like to have 3 residencies, 1 in South America, 1 in Europe, 1 either in the Gulf or in Asia, depending what makes sense or where my family wants to live. And
your
structure,
family office structure, would
my
that be
family office structure, I lean to Switzerland just because the talent is here.
and you hinted at it earlier, would 30 to 40% of your assets be US based?
I think it's negligent not to be. I think maybe I have maybe a Lux holdco or a Lux
Sure.
fund, but 30 to 40%, it's negligent not to.
Okay. And my final question, I think. You have spent, what, 25 plus years helping families stay.
1998, I've been here.
Okay, so longer, closer to actually 30. Near 30 years helping private families stay, my words, not yours, ahead of governments. And governments have spent those same number of years, near 30, looking to close that distance. Over the next couple of decades, who wins? The sovereigns, the state? Now, they do control the rules, or the families?
I will accept the premise for the purposes of answering the question, even though I reject the premise.
Okay. Well, thank you.
I would say the biggest difference between now and 20 and 30 years ago is that people thought paying taxes were optional, even though the obligation was there. I actually think the difference is today people work within the rules as they're designed to be. I think what you're going to see, I believe within 10 years, you're going to see a pillar 2 for individuals, which means you're going to see a global minimum tax probably at around the 15% rate, with an exit tax consistently of about 10% around the world. And I think that will be a universal. And I think tax will not be the driving force. I think the driving force will be about quality of life, water security, and food security, and personal safety.
Okay. Wow, this was really great, Marnin. You're awesome. I'm not going to wait 4 to 5 years, maybe even a little bit, like you said, me, you, and Markovici a little bit later this year. We'll end the year on
honestly, that will be a hell of a debate.
That would be.
People will pay money for that one.
I would hope so. Marnin, for those around the world that would like to learn more about your practice, how could they learn more? What website could they follow you on?
On the Baker McKenzie website, LinkedIn, and the Baker McKenzie website.
Yes, for everyone, Marnin Michaels, Baker McKenzie. You could look it up online. He's very searchable, has wonderful resources on LinkedIn as well. High recommendation from me. Unfortunately, I'm a little bit more verbose on answering that own question about me. So given some new audiences, hello, I am Angelo Robles. I'm the original founder of Family Office Association, which I ran for a decade and a half. I sold it, retired. I'm very active in the world of the single family office. My website is my name, pretty simple, angelorobles.com. It's a pretty comprehensive website. I'm the founder of SFO Continuity and Billionaire Mastermind, kind of think tank and consortiums of single family offices, multiple books. Many of you know I'm extremely active, not just talking, but building with AI and AI native family offices. And my latest book, just 2 days ago, you could download it from the website at angelorobles.com, related to what I mentioned with Marnin a minute or two ago. Should I have a family office? And by the way, I know some billionaires that I don't think a family office for them and what their needs, their continuity, their motivation to hire and fire and to build, I don't think they should all have a single family office. So as much as I am an advocate that the threshold for AUM, always a bad threshold, has definitely decreased, I don't think it's an automatic that you should. So learn more by going to angelorobles.com. Thank you all so much. Martin, you were fantastic. I wish we had a little more time, but I got my suit and tie and I'm ready to run to an appointment. Thank you so much. Look forward to next time.
Have a good day.
My pleasure. Thank you.